Associate Professor Jamus Lim.
Mr. Speaker, the amendments proposed to the Economic Expansion and Incentives Relief from Income Tax Act currently tabled are almost entirely of an operational nature. The bulk of the amendments concern two elements. Clause 2 inserts a new section that will allow the minister to vest unto a public body functions or powers afforded by the Act to the minister. Clauses 3 and 4 then introduce new definitions of greenhouse gas into the Act's tax incentive schemes, which aligns this government's green plan with this government's green plan, as well as the amendments to the Environmental Protection and Management Act, passed last year to this House. I do not oppose this bill, but I will offer two additional points for consideration consistent with both of these primary modifications. The Workers' Party sees little that is objectionable to providing stronger incentives to businesses for incorporating emissions-reducing projects into their capital expenditure plans. Indeed, in my speech on the motion, for the motion on the transition to a low-carbon society last month, I had suggested that government agencies should look for opportunities to weave green elements into their capital expenditure projects, providing analogous tax breaks for the private sector when they do so is entirely consistent with such a whole of society effort to address the climate emergency. And I am heartened that such efforts are being weaved into our existing legislation. But if I may say that we should not only look at the tax instrument to effect favorable shifts in corporate behavior. Subsidies must surely play a part too, and the effects of such positive incentives are even further amplified when they are simultaneously financed by taxes to discourage emissions-generating activity. In their contributions to the motion last month, my friends in this House also spoke about various ways that subsidies can be applied to enhance both the economic and political palatability of the green transition. The member from Aljunied, Jarogiam, spoke about putting in place incentives for households to install solar generation capacity in their private homes by subsidizing such installation before subsequently recovering the cost of these subsidies from the excess electricity produced by these homes. In a similar spirit, the member from Hougang, Dennis Tan, reiterated how carbon taxes could be channeled to ensure a just transition, especially among lower-income households and workers who may be displaced by moves toward a more environmentally sustainable economy. In the context of moving beyond tax breaks, I therefore wish to ask how the government plans to continue its financing of economic incentives for firms that will adopt such environmentally sustainable incentives. Would these follow the existing model for programs such as the NEA's Energy Efficiency Fund or the BCA's Green Mark Incentive Scheme via budget line items? Or will there be a more dedicated development fund that is established for this purpose? So, the second point I wish to touch on is how delegation could give rise to a loss of ownership and responsibility. More specifically, the danger I perceive is that after roles are transferred, the sense of responsibility unfortunately fails to follow. This gives rise to the risk, common even among single large organizations, and what this means for public agencies and functionaries could be a loss of ownership and control. Of course, I understand that the minister retains full and final de jure responsibility over any vested powers. Even so, as humans, it is often easy, too easy perhaps, for this buck to be passed. The last thing we want is a situation where one party appeals to the so-called Richard Nixon defense, where they didn't do anything, it was executed by some underling, and they were unaware, while the other claims the Nuremberg defense, famously presented by Adolf Eichmann and his collaborators in justifying their actions during World War II, which is that they were ordered and they didn't have any agency in the matter. Now, moreover, it would not surprise anyone in this House that politicians and bureaucrats are held accountable in a different manner. The former by voters during election time, and the latter by their peers and colleagues, or the public at large. As a consequence, the two face rather different incentives. Politicians are often motivated by the service to voters that they represent, which in turn influence their re-election prospects. Bureaucrats, in contrast, are guided more by careerist ambitions. If they excel, they can improve their chances for professional advancement or prospects in the private sector after they exit public service. This divergence between accountability structures and, in turn, behavioral outcomes means that policy may actually be more optimally executed by one group or the other, depending on the nature of the task at hand. In particular, research has suggested that complex tasks premised on ability rather than effort are better performed when delegated to bureaucrats. Politicians, conversely, are preferable if flexibility over our understanding of society's preferences is important, and this is especially so when there is a need to compensate potential losers arising from any associated policy reform. Let me put this into more concrete terms using two examples. The first has to do with monetary policy, which is rather topical in light of our nation's recent challenges with high inflation. The simple framework I have described suggests that the inflation target, say keeping core inflation under a 2% per annum rate, should be chosen by politicians, while the more technically challenging task of choosing the appropriate interest rate, the size of the balance sheet, and the specific exchange rate level, which would fall under the ambit of bankers ensconced within the Monetary Authority of Singapore. As another example, consider efforts to address income and wealth inequality. Here, my argument is that it should fall on elected representatives to determine how much inequality society can tolerate, which redistributive goals should be fair and just, would be fair and just, and what type of taxes we should accommodate. The technicalities of getting us there, adjusting specific marginal tax rates, executing efficient expenditures, and ensuring a balanced budget, these should then fall back into the laps of professionals in the Ministry of Finance. Now, turning back to the bill in question, I'm left to wonder whether there are specific conditions that should be fulfilled, such as when the matter is explicitly technical in nature, and when normative decision-making would not be asked for or required before the minister would then allow for such delegation. And what mechanisms are there in place to ensure that both de facto as well as de jure ownership of decisions remain with the respective minister?